When we think about trauma, we often think about the event itself. What happened? Where it happened? Who it happened to? But trauma does not just live in the past. It can live in the body. It can shape the way people think, feel, and respond to the world, even generations later. Generations later. And that's what we're exploring in this episode. Brent Diaz is a trauma therapist who I had the chance to speak with about what exactly trauma is and what it looks like and what it feels like in the body.
On one hand, trauma can be that single event that happens. So, the terrible event that happens in someone's life that then affects them in profound ways into the future. So, really, I mean, there's a lot of kind of hallmark events that people like to talk about. There's the car accident, there's the abusive experience, things like that. But there's also other ways that we could also look at this too. I mean, trauma can also be a series of events that are kind of that happen to a person's life over and over again, right? So we think of things like oppression, marginalization of different populations. That can be traumatizing to just experience, profound events like this day in and day out that also lead to similar kinds of symptoms. So. Yeah, so it can be just that one singular event. It could be a variety of different events, and then there's a whole other layer that is quite interesting to think about too. That really broadens the scope of what trauma is. So you have people who are exposed to these terrible events, but the events don't happen to them directly. So what happens is that these events, they experience these events through secondhand sources. Maybe they hear about a loved one who's experienced the event. Maybe they've witnessed the event happening, or maybe they've been exposed to the details of the event in some way. These kinds of exposures can also have the same kinds of impact on people. And my goodness, the second part of your question, how does trauma show up? I mean, there's just so many different ways that this can happen. Frequently, it shows up with feelings of not feeling safe, right? Feeling unsafety in one's life. That is a huge piece that I often see with the people that I work with. A lot of anxiety, a lot of panic attacks. Um, People also re-experience the traumatic events in different ways, right? So they will be reminded of the event. They'll maybe see something or hear something that reminds them of what happened to themselves, and then they'll re-experience it. It feels like the event is kind of happening all over again, just in one way or the other. So there's that. I mean, the thing about trauma is that the symptoms. There's so many symptoms that are kind of grouped into the PTSD piece. So there's so many more, but there's things like feeling spaced out. There's things like extreme anger or extreme shame around it, and so on. So you can see how experiencing these events can really lead to people having a really hard time coping and living through their lives.
What does trauma actually look like when it's carried over time? How is it passed down within families? And how do people begin to understand, process, and even heal with something they didn't experience themselves? Monica Bialski is the daughter of Polish Holocaust survivors and told me about how viscerally she feels her mother's memories and her mother's experiences.
You don't know what's happening. Where is this coming from? And also the sadness, there is some nostalgia, sadness when my mother just out of the blue would say, "I remember the smoke from the ghetto," and that, like, I'm telling it to you, it sounds like a sentence, but to me, even now, I can smell the ghetto smell because I really felt it as a child. I felt how my mother, how she was feeling and what was happening at that time.
I
One
think, and
day,
I want to know if you share this view. I'm convinced that it's not only what they told us, our parents, and what we read about it. I think it's in our genes. We inherited it. In other words,
I believe that.
the day we were born, before they told us a word about anything, before we read a word about anything, there's a sense of it inside us, and as a result, it affects how we behave. I mean, do you ever feel like guilt or struggling, feeling guilty about feeling joy?
Definitely, I agree with you 100%. It takes a lot of reflection, and even reflection before our conversation today, is that, there are some things that I cannot explain, that when something comes to my mind and I'm triggered, I feel this heaviness in my body. I feel my heaviness in my lungs, in my stomach. It's a very strange experience, but I do understand that this is a trigger from these emotions that really I cannot pinpoint it to any specific event. It must be what you're saying, in something in our genes.
There are numerous studies on intergenerational trauma and how trauma is passed down genetically from one generation to the other. Dorothy Goldwin is a second-generation Holocaust survivor who works with the Holocaust Memorial Committee in Memphis. How has your parents' history showed up in your body or in your emotional life over time?
My brother and I have talked a lot about this. Holding things in, not kinda saying, "This is okay, it's okay," when it's not okay.
Mm.
Thinking I can, and I noticed that my parents, that's what I learned from them, you don't talk about it. So it's been a work in progress to feel what I feel. My daughter, who is a psychologist, will tell me, "Is that what you're really feeling?" And it helps me, and am I great at it yet? No, it's a work in progress, but to realize when I'm feeling sad or angry or something's bothering me, not just if I hold it in, then I'm only hurting myself and other
Right,
people.
and
So,
that holding in, I think I'm curious if you agree, Dorothy, or not. I think that holding in, part of that has to do is as children, when we first find out and
yes,
learn about the Holocaust, we want to undo the Holocaust, which of course
yes.
can't be done. And we want to, in a way, parent our parents and protect our parents. Like, look what they went through. Why am I going to bother them with whatever happened to me in
Oh,
high
oh,
school?
of course,
Do
and
you get
that's
a
why
sense of that?
we always tried to do the right thing and protect them and not tell them, or even if you were sick or you didn't wanna tell them till you had to because, if I told my mother I had a cold, she's gonna worry about it until my cold is gone. So, it's sort of that same kind of feeling that, and I think we do pass that on too. You know, it, what happened to our parents is not gone with us or our children, but we deal with those traumas, but we also know that we have to push forward and make sure other people do know what happened to us so it won't happen again.
Willie Handler is a second-generation Holocaust survivor and author who also experienced intergenerational trauma.
I think I was exposed to two sources of trauma. Hard to separate out the two because some of it was inherited, passed down genetically, and there's lots of science to support that. But as well, our household in my childhood was not, you know, was not what I would call typical or conventional.
Tell me in
And
what way?
well, I was very
Give me some
much
examples.
I am. We were very much left on our own.
Mhm.
No one to help you with homework or problems at school. If you wanted to play sports, you take yourself. There's no one to take you, and so you grow up um, with a fair amount of separation anxiety, and that has sort of followed me through life. And that is not that's not the trauma that I inherited. The trauma I inherited is quite different, where um, I, well, how can I describe a lot of hypervigilance,
Mhm.
very sensitive to anti-Semitism and hate, things like that. So, and those two are very, very different.
For some survivors of traumatic events, memories can be suppressed. It's actually our body's way of protecting us from the horrors of what we've endured. But those memories still exist within us, buried deep. And sometimes all it takes is watching a movie to trigger a traumatic response. Aviva Batak is a Holocaust survivor, originally from Lithuania, whose parents sent her away to be hidden by a Gentile family during the Holocaust, a decision that ultimately would save her life.
My therapist she was also one of my professors, but she became my therapist because she thought I was a challenge. And she discovered a lot of the nightmares that I was having that I could not remember. And she had a confrere who was a hypnotist. And she asked me if I would agree to be hypnotized. And I said I had no problem with it because my husband and I at parties were always hypnotized.
Right.
So I had no problem with it. And they hypnotized me. And what we discovered was a lot of my traumas came because when I was with the Gentile family, they built a special part of the toilet in the back of the toilet. And let me tell you how that all came about. I'm sure you know that a good therapist always gives homework. And one of the things that she gave me for homework is I had to go see Schindler's List, the movie. I had never seen a war movie. I never went to a war movie. I never watched anything that had that kind of violence on television.
Unusual homework, I have to say.
Well, yes. Okay. I went with my husband and another couple who were very close friends of mine. There's a scene in that movie where the children are running away because there's a children's action going on, trying to hide. And this one little boy finds a place behind a toilet with all the feces there. And I went ballistics, screaming in the theater. They literally had to, three of them drag me out of the theater. Of course, I came home, called her immediately and said, "What the did you do to me?" Okay. She said, "Get into my office now." And she didn't live far from me. So my husband immediately took me to her office. And she said to me, she says, "Aviva, this is where we're going to bring in a hypnotist because I've got to find out what happened to you." Because I did not remember ever being hidden. What they were doing is when the Germans would come into the farm, either to steal the food or to look for Jews, they would hide me in this back of the toilet in an enclosed area.
Right.
I had no memory of it. To this day, I still have no memory of it. And they would take me out after the Nazis left. So this was a revelation that I found out in therapy.
If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to rate, follow, or subscribe to Chosen for What wherever you get your podcasts. To make a donation or to learn more about the Foundation for Genocide Education, visit their website at gened.org. Don't worry, the link can be found on the show notes for the Foundation for Genocide Education. I'm Tommy Schnurmacher. Until next time.